and you can tell it not by what they say, but by the way their body slightly stiffens the moment the word visit appears in a conversation, as if someone has just suggested rearranging their inner world without permission. They smile, of course. They nod. They say, sure, maybe sometime. But inside, something quietly closes. Because for them, guests are not laughter and cups of tea left on the table, not voices in the kitchen or shoes by the door. Guests are a slow erosion of silence, of order, of the fragile calm they built with their own hands after too many loud years. There is a man who lives alone in a small apartment where everything stands exactly where it should, not because he is obsessed with cleanliness, but because every object is proof that nothing will suddenly demand his attention, and when someone comes over, even for an hour, the walls seem to lean inward, listening, remembering how it used to be when he had no space of his own at all. He remembers how, as a child, guests meant being told to behave, to smile properly, to answer questions he didn't understand, while adults laughed too loudly and stayed too long, and the night ended with tired anger and dishes in the sink. So now, years later, when someone knocks, his first instinct is not joy, but defense. There is a woman who loves people deeply, who listens carefully, who sends long messages at night, and yet she hates having guests, because when people sit on her couch, drink from her mugs, touch her things, she feels as though she is being slowly erased, as though her private rhythm is being interrupted by someone else's tempo, louder, faster, more demanding. She cleans before they arrive, not out of politeness, but out of fear, fear of being seen too clearly, judged too quickly, misunderstood forever in one careless glance. And when the guests finally leave, she doesn't feel relief immediately. First there is a hollow quiet, the echo of voices still hanging in the air, reminding her how much effort it takes to be normal. People think those who dislike guests are cold, arrogant, unfriendly. But often, they are simply people who learned very early that company comes with a price, and they paid it too many times already. Some people don't open their doors easily, not because they are hiding something shameful, but because once upon a time, every open door led to intrusion, to questions that went too far, to laughter that didn't include them, to advice they never asked for. They remember guests who stayed until midnight, who commented on their choices, their bodies, their lives, and left behind a strange feeling of being smaller than before. So now, they choose silence. They choose empty rooms and dim lights in the evening, where no one expects them to entertain, explain, perform, or prove that their life makes sense. There is a certain peace in knowing that no one will ring the bell, that no one will sit across from you asking why you live the way you do, why you are alone, why you are different, why you haven't become someone else. And yes, some of them are lonely, painfully, quietly lonely, but the loneliness they chose feels kinder than company that drains them dry. They know that after guests leave, there will be that familiar moment when the door closes, the lock clicks, and suddenly the room feels both too empty and finally breathable, and they stand there for a second, listening to the silence, unsure whether to mourn or celebrate it. Maybe that's why they say, "I don't like guests," when what they really mean is, "I like myself better when I am alone." And perhaps that is not cruelty, not rudeness, not selfishness, but survival shaped into habit. Because not every heart was built for crowds. And not every home is meant to be shared. Sometimes, the most honest hospitality is knowing when not to invite anyone in. There are people who say they don't like guests, and even they themselves cannot always explain why this simple idea, someone sitting at their table, touching their space, staying a little too long, fills them with a quiet, unreasonable heaviness, as if the body remembers something the mind has learned to ignore. Often, it begins in childhood. In homes where guests were not joy, but tension, where a child learned early that visitors meant raised voices, nervous smiles, forced politeness, and the unspoken rule that their own needs would have to wait until everyone else was satisfied. The house would change before guests arrived, furniture moved, voices lowered, children warned not to speak too much or too loudly, and the child understood one thing very clearly: when others come, you disappear. Some children learned that guests meant comparison. They were lined up like objects on display, asked to perform, to answer questions, to prove something: intelligence, obedience, success, while adults nodded, judged, whispered, and the child stood there feeling exposed, smaller with every word spoken about them, as if they weren't even in the room. Others learned that guests meant invasion. Relatives who stayed too long, who opened doors without knocking, who touched personal things, who laughed at private details, who treated the child's room, the child's body, the child's emotions as public property. No one asked if it was comfortable. No one noticed the silence growing thicker. So the child adapted. They learned to stay quiet. They learned to observe. They learned that safety lives in invisibility. Years later, as adults, they may not remember specific moments, only the feeling remains: a tightening in the chest, a need to clean, to control, to prepare endlessly before someone arrives, because chaos once came disguised as a friendly visit. They don't hate guests. They fear losing themselves. For some people, solitude is not emptiness, it is recovery. It is the first place where they were finally allowed to exist without explanation, without apology, without the constant sense of being evaluated by invisible eyes sitting across the table. They learned early that being around others meant adapting, bending, shrinking, so when they grew up and locked their own doors, they did not feel imprisoned, they felt relieved. There is a particular kind of loneliness that grows from emotional neglect, from homes where adults were present but unavailable, where conversations never reached the depth a child needed, where comfort was conditional and affection unpredictable. Those children grew into adults who crave closeness, but only on their own terms, because uncontrolled closeness once hurt too much. Guests disrupt that fragile balance. Guests bring noise into a life carefully built around calm. They ask questions that reopen old wounds, even when the questions are innocent, even when spoken kindly. Why don't you have more friends? Why are you always alone? Why don't you invite anyone? Each question sounds like an accusation, like proof that something is wrong with them. And so they choose silence, not because they don't love people, but because loving people once cost them their sense of safety. After guests leave, they stand alone in the doorway, listening to the echo of footsteps fading down the stairs, feeling that familiar mix of grief and relief, grief for the connection they wanted to enjoy, relief that they survived it. Loneliness becomes familiar. Familiar becomes safe. Safe becomes home. And maybe the tragedy is not that some people hate guests, but that they learned so early that company required self-erasure. So they protect their solitude the way others protect family, fiercely, quietly, without explanation. Because for them, being alone is not a failure of love, but the last place where love does not hurt. And maybe one day, when the house is quiet again, when the light is low and the world outside finally stops demanding explanations, they will sit alone in the center of their own silence and understand something simple and painful at the same time. That the closed door was never about hatred. It was about survival. It was about a child who once learned that guests meant disappearing, that love had conditions, that attention was dangerous, that being seen too clearly could cost too much. It was about an adult who grew tired of pretending that every knock on the door is a gift, when for them it has always sounded like a warning. Some people do not invite guests because they are cold. They do it because their heart has already been overcrowded once, with fear, noise, judgment, and unmet needs, and they refuse to let that happen again. So they choose silence. They choose dim evenings and untouched cups. They choose a life where the air finally belongs to them. And if you recognize yourself in this story, know this: there is nothing broken in you. You are not strange. You are not wrong. You simply learned too early that peace was fragile, and you learned to protect it. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for listening, for feeling, for being present in this quiet space. If this story resonated with you, support the channel with a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe if you want more stories that speak softly, but stay for a long time. See you next time.